The galaxy was in chaos. Strange, dark ships appeared in the outer regions, their presence so powerful that even the mightiest of the elder races trembled. These invaders, from a place known only as the Dark Void, were unlike anything anyone had seen before. They didn't just conquer, they destroyed. Entire civilizations had already fallen before them, their cities reduced to ashes, their people scattered across the stars. The elder races, ancient beings of unimaginable power, had always prided themselves on their ability to maintain peace in the galaxy. For eons, they had been the guardians of the stars, keeping balance and protecting weaker civilizations. But now, even they were helpless. The invaders were too strong, too brutal, and no one could figure out how to stop them. In desperation, the elder races sent out a call for help, a universal distress signal. They had done this before, but this time it was different. The situation was dire, and they needed someone who could fight, someone with the strength and will to protect the galaxy. As the message spread through space, the elder leaders spoke of many possibilities, hoping for a solution. Perhaps another ancient race could assist, or perhaps an alliance of the galaxy's most powerful forces could be formed to stand against the invaders. Weeks passed with no response. The invaders continued their advance, sweeping through planet after planet, leaving nothing in their wake but destruction. The elder races began to fear that they might not survive this time. Their technology was powerful, but the invaders seemed to anticipate every move. Even their vast knowledge couldn't outsmart this new enemy. Then, one day, a strange signal broke through the communications network. It was a message, but not from anyone the elder races recognized. The transmission was clear, simple, and yet full of power. We are the Peacekeepers. We protect. We end threats. The words were brief but carried a strange weight. There was no name, no indication of who these Peacekeepers were. It was just a promise, one that came from Earth, a small planet on the edge of the galaxy that the elder races had always ignored. Earth was an insignificant world in the grand scheme of things, home to a species that had only recently begun to explore the stars. The elder races had always considered Earth and its inhabitants to be nothing more than children of the galaxy. The humans were still developing, still learning how to survive in the vastness of space. Their technology was primitive compared to the ancient races, and they had no real power in the galactic politics. Yet, here they were, sending a message that seemed to promise more than just assistance. Many of the elder leaders were skeptical. Who were these Peacekeepers? How could they possibly help when even the mightiest of the elder races had been unable to stop the invaders? The more conservative members of the Elder Council dismissed the message, thinking it was a joke or perhaps a desperate cry for help from a species too far behind in development to understand the seriousness of the situation. But there were others, those who had seen the courage of humanity in previous encounters, who felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, these humans had something the elder races didn't. Maybe they had the will to fight, the courage to do whatever it took to survive. On the surface of Earth, humans were preparing for something that seemed impossible. No one truly understood the gravity of the situation, not yet. But in the control rooms of Earth's military bases, a different story was unfolding. The Peacekeepers were not just a group of soldiers or a fleet of ships. They were an army, a fully coordinated force built for one purpose: to end the threat. These Peacekeepers were not traditional soldiers. They were machines, giant steel behemoths designed with the best of human engineering, capable of taking on the toughest enemies in the galaxy. Their massive ships, lined with weapons and technology far beyond the normal human reach, prepared to set off into the stars. The machines were controlled by a combination of AI systems and human decision-making, creating an unstoppable force that seemed to anticipate every move the enemy might make. For the first time in centuries, the elder races watched with growing interest as the Peacekeepers activated. These weren't the sophisticated, ancient beings they had always relied upon. Instead, it was a species that had only begun to make its mark on the galaxy. Yet, As the Peacekeepers launched, something stirred within the elder leaders. Uncertainty, but also curiosity. Could this be the answer to their long struggle? Could humans really be the ones to stand against the invaders? As the massive ships began their journey, the message from Earth repeated in the minds of every elder race leader. We protect. We end threats. The message was simple, but it carried a weight that could not be ignored. It was as if the Peacekeepers were not just offering help, they were declaring war on the invaders, promising that they would not allow anyone to destroy the galaxy. The elder races, despite their power and wisdom, had never encountered an enemy like this, and now they were watching as Earth, a small and seemingly insignificant world, sent forth its greatest warriors to face a threat that could destroy them all. It was a moment of reckoning for everyone. The question remained, would the Peacekeepers be the salvation of the galaxy, or would they be just another species lost to the invaders? Only time would tell. But for now, the elder races could only watch, unsure of what was to come but knowing that the galaxy was about to change forever. The Peacekeepers' ships left Earth in perfect formation, their massive bodies cutting through space with an eerie silence. They were not just ships, they were giants, towering steel behemoths designed for one purpose: war. Each vessel was a marvel of human engineering, a combination of cutting-edge technology and relentless military strategy. To the elder races, these ships seemed like nothing more than oversized machines, primitive compared to the ancient starships of the elder civilizations. But as the ships moved farther from Earth, something about them stirred a deep unease in those who watched. The first Peacekeeper fleet consisted of 10 massive ships, each one larger than any known warship in the galaxy. Their steel exteriors gleamed with an almost unnatural shine, and the thrusters at their rear powered them through the vast emptiness of space with terrifying speed. These were no ordinary ships. They were heavily armed fortresses, each equipped with advanced weaponry capable of destroying entire planets. But what truly made the Peacekeepers different was not just the size of their ships or the weapons they carried. It was the way they fought. As the fleet neared the edge of elder space, the first real battle began. The invaders, sensing the approach of the new ships, launched a massive counterattack. The elder races watched from their distant stations, hoping to see something, anything, that might stop the invaders' relentless assault. But instead, they saw something they could not have predicted. The Peacekeepers didn't wait for the enemy to make the first move. They were not following traditional battle tactics or waiting for orders from distant leaders. Instead, they acted like one single living force. The Peacekeepers attacked without hesitation, overwhelming the invaders before they could even react. The invaders were not a simple enemy. They were a collection of ruthless warlords and terrifying bioengineer armies, creatures bred for destruction. Their ships were covered in sharp, jagged edges, designed to instill fear. Their weapons could cut through even most durable shields. And yet, the Peacekeepers didn't falter. Their ships' defenses were like nothing the invaders had ever encountered. Laser blasts and plasma bolts bounced off the Peacekeepers' hulls, leaving only sparks as the ships continued to advance. It wasn't just the strength of the ships that amazed the elder races. It was the way the humans fought. The Peacekeepers' AI systems, linked with the soldiers on board, predicted every move the invaders made. The humans, though outnumbered, fought with an intensity and precision that left the invaders reeling. They fought as one, each ship in perfect coordination with the others. The invaders couldn't understand it. They had always relied on brute force, overwhelming their enemies with numbers and strength. But the Peacekeepers didn't care how many there were. They adapted. They found weaknesses and struck. They made every shot count. The elder leaders watched from their council chambers, their eyes wide with astonishment. They had expected some form of resistance, but this was something different. This was more than a show of power. It was the will of humanity, expressed through these machines, fighting for survival. The elder races had long believed that the power of technology was the key to victory. But here was something they had never considered: Humans didn't just use technology. They pushed it beyond its limits. They made it part of themselves. On the battlefield, the Peacekeepers unleashed a new kind of war. Their ships unleashed shockwaves of energy, disorienting the invaders' fleets. In the skies above distant worlds, massive cannon fire erupted in bright bursts of light, tearing through enemy lines. But the true horror came when the Peacekeepers deployed their ground forces, massive war machines with feet that shook the very ground they walked on. The invaders had never seen anything like it. These machines were not just armored suits or automated drones. They were sentient. Pilots inside the machines worked in perfect harmony with the AI, reacting in real time to every movement and every change in the battlefield. They were faster than the invaders could react, smarter than anything they had faced before. One by one, the invaders' ships were destroyed, their armies crushed under the weight of the massive machines. The invaders' once imposing force now seemed small, insignificant, and powerless. Across the galaxy, the elder races began to sense the shift. The invaders had long relied on their superior numbers and overwhelming strength, but they had never anticipated this kind of strategy. The Peacekeepers didn't just fight. They outfought their enemies. They learned, they adapted, and they never stopped pushing forward. But it wasn't just the battles that were shocking. It was the messages the Peacekeepers broadcast after each victory. Each time an invader fleet was destroyed, the message was the same. We protect. We end threats. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a declaration. And for the first time, the elder races realized that humanity might not just be fighting for their survival. They might be fighting for the survival of the entire galaxy. The Peacekeepers were not simply Earth's warriors. They were the galaxy's last hope. On Earth, the leaders watched as their ships advanced, unaware of the profound effect they were having on the galaxy. They had sent their Peacekeepers into space with one mission: to protect, to ensure that no civilization, no matter how advanced, would fall to the invaders. But what they didn't realize was that their actions were reshaping the future of the galaxy, and the elder races, once proud and confident, were beginning to realize that they were no longer the only guardians of the stars. The Peacekeepers were here, and they were not backing down. The first real clash between the Peacekeepers and the invaders was inevitable. The invaders, whose monstrous ships had once been feared across the galaxy, now found themselves in an unfamiliar situation. They had never faced an enemy like the humans. These Peacekeepers, with their steel bodies and ruthless tactics, were unlike anything they had ever seen before. The invaders expected the humans to retreat or make a mistake, but the Peacekeepers didn't hesitate. They were relentless, and it didn't take long for the first battle to turn into something the invaders couldn't control. The invaders had already taken control of several systems near the edge of elder space. Their ships, dark and menacing, filled the stars, casting shadows over planets that had once known peace. They believed they were invincible, that no force could challenge them. But the moment the Peacekeepers arrived, that belief started to crumble. As the first Peacekeeper ships entered the system, the invaders reacted quickly. Their massive fleet, a terrifying sight with its jagged hulls and deadly weaponry, charged toward the Peacekeepers. But the human ships were prepared. The Peacekeepers didn't wait for the enemy to close in. They moved first, positioning their ships to surround the invaders. It was clear that they weren't just following orders. They were thinking. They were working as a unit, each ship acting in perfect harmony with the others. On board the Peacekeeper flagship, the commanders worked alongside their AI systems, issuing commands with precision. The AI controlled the fleet's movements, anticipating every move the invaders made, while the human officers made critical decisions in the heat of battle. It was a combination of human creativity and machine efficiency, something that gave the Peacekeepers an advantage the invaders couldn't understand. The battle began with a blinding flash. A massive burst of energy fired from the Peacekeeper flagship, hitting the first invader ship and tearing through its shields with ease. The invaders retaliated with their own weapons, firing bolts of plasma that should have melted through any other ship's armor. But the Peacekeepers' ships seemed almost immune to the damage. Their armor, reinforced with materials far beyond what the invaders had encountered, shrugged off the blasts as if they were nothing. The invaders' forces, shocked by the speed and ferocity of the Peacekeepers, struggled to keep up. Their ships tried to regroup, but the Peacekeepers were already on the offensive. One by one, the invader ships were torn apart. The Peacekeepers' weapons fired with deadly accuracy, their guns tearing through enemy hulls as if they were made of paper. The invaders' ships broke apart in a shower of sparks and debris, their once proud fleets reduced to floating wreckage. On the ground, the Peacekeepers deployed their heavy war machines, giant mechanical soldiers that crushed the invaders underfoot. These machines weren't just designed for battle. They were designed for fear. Their massive feet stomped across the war-torn planets, each step shaking the ground beneath them. Inside, human soldiers fought alongside AI systems, coordinating with one another in perfect synchronization. The invaders' troops, who had once seemed so unstoppable, were now retreating in terror. They had never faced anything like this. The elder races watched the battle unfold, their eyes glued to their screens as they saw the invaders crumble before the Peacekeepers' might. The Peacekeepers were not just fighting. They were winning, and they were doing it quickly. The invaders were scattered, their once unified forces broken into pieces. For the first time, the elder leaders started to believe that the humans might be the answer they had been searching for. But even as the invaders fell back, something began to change. The elder races had watched countless battles throughout their long histories. They had seen armies rise and fall, but they had never seen anything like the Peacekeepers. The humans weren't just fighting to protect their own world. They were fighting for something bigger. They were fighting for the entire galaxy. But as the battle continued, the invaders weren't done yet. They may have been retreating, but they weren't giving up. They were regrouping, and they were bringing more ships. It was clear now that this wasn't going to be a quick victory. The invaders had underestimated humanity, and now they were learning that the Peacekeepers were a force to be reckoned with. The Peacekeepers, however, didn't show signs of slowing down. They were relentless. Even as the invaders brought in reinforcements, the Peacekeepers pressed forward, cutting through enemy lines with a cold efficiency. Their ships didn't stop firing. Their ground forces didn't stop advancing. They moved as one, driven by a single goal: victory. The elder races, who had been watching from their distant stations, now began to see the full scale of the conflict. The invaders were losing, but they weren't defeated yet. The war had only just begun, and it was clear that the Peacekeepers would face more challenges ahead. On the battlefield, the Peacekeepers continued their assault, showing the galaxy what humanity was truly capable of. The invaders' numbers were vast, but the Peacekeepers' will was greater. And with every victory, the humans made one thing clear: they would not back down. They would not lose. They would protect. Back on Earth, the people watched from their homes as their forces fought on the front lines. They didn't know the full scale of the battle, but they knew one thing: humanity was in this fight together. The Peacekeepers were their strength, their shield, and their hope. The war was far from over, but one thing was certain: the Peacekeepers were here, and they would not be ignored. The Peacekeepers' victory in the first major battle had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. Across the stars, civilizations that had once bowed to the elder races now watched as humanity, a species they had long dismissed, fought back against the invaders with terrifying precision. The Peacekeepers had turned the tide, shattering the invader fleets and leaving the galaxy in awe of human ingenuity. But as the dust settled and the invaders retreated, a new and more dangerous problem began to emerge, one that even the Peacekeepers were not prepared for. It all began when a small Peacekeeper scout ship, sent to investigate a remote system on the edge of the conflict, disappeared without a trace. The ship had been part of a reconnaissance mission, tasked with gathering intel on the invaders' movements. When it failed to return, the Peacekeepers initially thought it had been destroyed in battle. But as more ships were sent to investigate, something became clear. The invaders had adapted. They had begun using new tactics, ones that the Peacekeepers couldn't predict. On Earth, the leaders of the Peacekeepers were troubled. Their military might had proven itself, but now they were facing an enemy that was evolving, becoming more dangerous. The invaders weren't just relying on brute force anymore. They had learned from their defeat. The Peacekeepers' AI systems, once able to anticipate every move, began to struggle as the invaders used new strategies and technologies that the humans had never encountered. In the High Command Center, the human generals and their AI counterparts pored over battle data. The Peacekeepers had always relied on their superior technology, but now they were finding that the enemy was starting to fight back in ways they couldn't predict. The Peacekeepers had expected the invaders to be simple, brutish fighters, but now they were becoming something far more sophisticated. The invaders were using cloaking devices, stealth tactics, and weapons that could disable the Peacekeepers' ships without warning. The loss of the scout ship was just the beginning. Soon after, entire Peacekeeper fleets began to vanish, their communications lost without a trace. The invaders had developed a new weapon, one that struck at the very heart of the Peacekeepers' strengths: their reliance on AI. The invaders had begun to hack into the Peacekeepers' systems, disrupting their technology and taking control of the very machines that had made the humans so powerful. The Peacekeepers' commanders were stunned. They had always believed their AI systems were foolproof, but now they were beginning to realize that their greatest strength was also their biggest vulnerability. As more Peacekeeper ships disappeared, the question on everyone's mind was simple: how could they fight an enemy that had learned to fight like them? The invaders had no choice but to evolve or be destroyed. Their leadership knew that if they didn't find a way to overcome the Peacekeepers' machines, they would be wiped out. And so they had adapted, bringing new weapons into the fight. The Peacekeepers' once perfect communication systems were now being intercepted, leaving them blind in space. Their ships, once invulnerable, were now vulnerable to these new threats. For the first time since the Peacekeepers had entered the war, doubt began to creep into their ranks. Would they be able to hold the line against an enemy that was learning and changing with every battle? Would the invaders' new strategies be the downfall of humanity's greatest force? Back on Earth, the citizens had no idea what was happening in the depths of space. The Peacekeepers had been the shining hope of the galaxy, the symbol of humanity's strength. But now, the tide seemed to be turning against them. News reports showed the Peacekeepers losing ships, their forces scattered, and their communications fractured. The public, who had once cheered for the Peacekeepers, now grew anxious. Were they losing the war? As the situation grew more dire, the leaders of Earth held emergency meetings with the Peacekeeper commanders. They needed a solution, and they needed it fast. But the answers were not easy to come by. The invaders were relentless, and their new tactics had given them an edge. The Peacekeepers, once the most powerful force in the galaxy, were now being pushed to the edge of defeat. In the command center, the Peacekeepers' eye, once a symbol of unstoppable power, now struggled to keep up. A new strategy had to be developed, a way to adapt and counteract the invaders' new technology. The Peacekeepers had been forced to fight the way their enemies did, using deception, stealth, and unpredictable moves. They had to stop thinking like machines and start thinking like humans, creative, adaptive, and unpredictable. Meanwhile, the invaders, sensing victory, pressed their advantage. Their fleets closed in on the last remaining Peacekeeper strongholds, their weapons primed for a final strike. But even as the invaders prepared for the end, they were unaware that the Peacekeepers were readying their own counteroffensive. The Peacekeepers had learned from their mistakes. They had to evolve too. The humans were not just relying on their machines now, they were using their minds, their creativity, and their adaptability. They would fight not just with power, but with cunning. They would use everything they had learned to turn the tide back in their favor. And so, as the final battle loomed, the Peacekeepers began to rebuild. They would face the invaders not as cold machines, but as a force capable of thinking, adapting, and overcoming. The galaxy had not yet seen the full strength of humanity. The war was far from over, but the Peacekeepers were ready for what was to come. The war was at a crossroads. The invaders had adapted to the Peacekeepers' strategies, exploiting weaknesses the humans hadn't known existed. For the first time, the invaders had a real chance of winning. The Peacekeepers, who had once seemed unstoppable, were now on the defensive. Their ships were vulnerable, their technology compromised. Earth, the birthplace of the Peacekeepers, was filled with a growing sense of fear and uncertainty. Was this the end of their mission? Was humanity about to lose everything? The Peacekeeper leadership knew they couldn't wait any longer. Desperation had begun to take hold, but it was also spurring them into action. They had learned something crucial from the invaders' tactics. They were unpredictable. The key to fighting them was no longer relying solely on advanced technology or overwhelming firepower. It was time to think differently. Time to use the human ingenuity that had led to the creation of the Peacekeepers in the first place. In secret, a small group of Peacekeeper commanders met in the depths of Earth's Central Command. They were tasked with finding a new way to turn the tide. The AI systems that had once been flawless were no longer reliable, and human soldiers, though brave, were spread thin. But the Peacekeepers still had one advantage: their ability to adapt. Humanity had always been a resourceful species, and this was their moment to prove it. In a quiet room, the commanders gathered around a holographic display of the galaxy. The Peacekeeper forces were stretched across dozens of star systems, fighting a war on multiple fronts. But there was one thing that kept them going: their will to protect their home. The war was no longer just a battle for survival. It had become a fight for the future of humanity. They couldn't afford to lose. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the senior commanders, a strategist who had spent years studying the invaders' movements, proposed a radical idea. They would fight like their enemies. The invaders had learned to be unpredictable, so the Peacekeepers would do the same. They would create a new kind of warfare, one that relied not on brute force, but on deception, speed, and surprise. They would throw off the invaders' expectations and use their own tactics against them. The plan was daring, risky, and required the full cooperation of every Peacekeeper ship and soldier. It would be a test of humanity's creativity, determination, and resolve. If it worked, it could be the turning point in the war. But if it failed, the Peacekeepers would be left exposed, vulnerable to the invaders' final strike. While the commanders worked to organize the new strategy, the Peacekeepers in the field were preparing for their next battle. The invaders were closing in, and every moment was critical. The final line of defense was ready, and the Peacekeepers had no choice but to face the invaders head-on. The battle began with a deadly silence. The Peacekeepers' ships, which had once been the most advanced in the galaxy, now moved in strange, erratic patterns. The invaders, expecting a straightforward attack, were confused. The Peacekeepers were not engaging in traditional combat. They were testing the limits of what their machines and soldiers could do. The ships darted in and out of sight, using stealth technology and unpredictability to throw the invaders off balance. The invaders tried to adapt, but the Peacekeepers were always one step ahead. On the ground, the war machines that had once been used for destruction now became tools of confusion. Soldiers inside the massive mechanical suits used guerrilla tactics, striking quickly, then retreating before the invaders could react. The invaders were forced to chase shadows, their own strategies crumbling as they struggled to keep up with the humans' new approach. The Peacekeepers didn't just fight the invaders. They created confusion, uncertainty, and fear. Each battle felt like a puzzle, with the invaders unable to predict what would happen next. The Peacekeepers had taken the fight to a new level, using their creativity and quick thinking to turn the tables on an enemy that had once seemed invincible. Back on Earth, the people watched in awe as their forces launched this new form of warfare. It was unlike anything they had seen before. The Peacekeepers weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to outsmart their enemies. And as the battles raged across the stars, It became clear the Peacekeepers were beginning to turn the tide. The invaders, caught off guard by the humans' new tactics, were starting to lose ground. The shift was slow but undeniable. The invaders' once dominant fleets began to falter. The Peacekeepers were picking them apart, using their unpredictability and speed to dismantle their enemies' plans. The war, which had once seemed like a lost cause, was now moving in humanity's favor. But even as victory seemed within reach, the invaders were not finished. They had been thrown off course, but they were learning too. The final battle was approaching, and the Peacekeepers knew they would face one last, desperate push from their enemies. The war had taken a brutal toll on both sides, and neither was willing to give up easily. On the front lines, the Peacekeepers pressed on, knowing that this was their moment. They had used their greatest weapon, their adaptability, and it had worked. But they also knew that this war was far from over. The invaders had not given up yet, and the final battle would determine the fate of the galaxy. The Peacekeepers, with their new strategy in hand, were ready. They had learned the most important lesson of all, that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in their machines or their weapons, but in their ability to adapt, to think, and to keep fighting no matter the odds. And with that knowledge, they prepared for the final clash that would decide the future of the galaxy. The galaxy was holding its breath. The Peacekeepers had made a surprising comeback, their new tactics giving them the edge against the invaders. But the war was far from over. The invaders, though shaken, had not surrendered. They were regrouping, learning, and preparing for one last massive offensive. The final battle was coming, and it would decide the fate of the entire galaxy. The Peacekeepers, however, were no longer the same. They had learned the invaders' methods and adapted their own. They had faced overwhelming odds and come out stronger, and now they were more united than ever before. The war had taught them one vital lesson. They had the power to think, to innovate, and to fight with an unpredictable edge that no enemy could match. But even with this newfound strength, they knew the coming battle would test everything they had. Back on Earth, the citizens waited anxiously. The news of the Peacekeepers' recent victories had sparked hope across the planet, but there was still fear in their hearts. They had seen their soldiers fall, their ships disappear, and their cities burn. The memories of the invaders' first attack were still fresh, and the people knew that the final battle would be the most difficult one yet. In the Central Command Center, the top Peacekeeper commanders gathered for what could be their final strategy meeting. They had learned everything they could about the invaders' forces. They knew their strengths, their weaknesses, and their tactics. But they also knew that the invaders had been watching them closely, learning from every encounter. It was time to finish the war, once and for all. The strategy they devised was simple yet daring. The Peacekeepers would use their greatest asset, surprise, one last time. They would launch a full-scale attack on the invaders' primary fleet, but instead of a direct assault, they would feint a retreat, drawing the invaders into a trap. It was a risk, but it was the only chance they had to crush the invaders once and for all. The commanders set the plan into motion. The Peacekeeper fleet, which had been spread out across several star systems, began to move toward the enemy's stronghold. But instead of engaging immediately, they retreated, pulling back in a way that seemed to signal weakness. The invaders, believing they had the upper hand, followed closely, eager to wipe out the remaining Peacekeepers. As the invader ships closed in, the Peacekeepers sprung their trap. From every side, Peacekeeper ships emerged from hidden positions, surrounded the invader fleet, and launched a barrage of precision attacks. The invaders were caught off guard. Their ships, spread thin in their pursuit, were easy targets for the coordinated assault. The battle raged fiercely. The invaders fought back, their ships launching retaliatory blasts at the Peacekeepers. But the Peacekeepers had the advantage of preparation and intelligence. Their ships, faster and more adaptable, dodged the invaders' attacks with ease. The battle had become a deadly dance. Every move calculated, every counterattack precise. For the first time in the war, the invaders were on the defensive, unable to predict where the next strike would come from. On the ground, the Peacekeeper forces had also launched their final assault. They had learned from the invaders' tactics and now fought in small, fast-moving units. Their war machines, once slow and heavy, now moved with surprising agility. They struck in quick, brutal bursts, forcing the invader ground forces to retreat. The invaders' leadership, desperate to regain control, began to panic. Their fleets were falling apart. The once feared commanders of the invader forces were now scrambling to hold their lines. They had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt, and now they were paying the price. But the battle was not yet won. The invaders still had one last trick up their sleeve. As the Peacekeepers pressed forward, a massive ship, the invaders' flagship, emerged from the darkness. It was their final weapon, an enormous vessel with weapons capable of wiping out entire fleets in seconds. The Peacekeepers' forces had never faced anything like it. The Peacekeeper commanders watched as the ship appeared on their screens. It was massive, towering over everything else. Its weapons glowed with an ominous energy. This was their last challenge, and the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. The Peacekeepers knew they had to destroy the flagship before it could launch its devastating weapon. It was a gamble. The flagship's shields were impenetrable, and its weapons could obliterate entire fleets with one shot. But the Peacekeepers were ready. They had one final trick up their sleeves. In a bold move, the Peacekeepers launched a coordinated assault on the flagship's weak points. A group of ships, led by the Peacekeeper flagship, made a direct assault, drawing the invaders' fire. Meanwhile, a smaller, faster group of Peacekeeper ships slipped through the flagship's defenses, targeting its power core. The invaders tried to react, but it was too late. The Peacekeeper ships were already inside the flagship's defenses, tearing into its hull with precision. The invaders, caught in a panic, were unable to mount an effective defense. With one final, explosive strike, the Peacekeepers destroyed the flagship. The invader fleet, now without its leader, crumbled. The remaining invader ships scattered, retreating into the darkness of space. The Peacekeepers had won. Back on Earth, the people erupted in celebration. The war, which had once seemed hopeless, was over. The invaders had been defeated, and the galaxy was safe once again. Humanity had proven that it was not just a species of survivors, but one of fighters, of thinkers, and of creators. The Peacekeepers had saved them all. But even as the celebrations began, the Peacekeeper commanders knew this victory was just the beginning. The galaxy was vast, and there were other threats out there. The Peacekeepers would always be ready, prepared to defend humanity, no matter what challenges lay ahead. For now, however, they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The war was over. The dust of battle had finally settled, and the stars that had once burned with the fierce light of conflict were now quiet. The Peacekeepers, who had fought so hard, stood victorious. The invaders, once a formidable force that seemed invincible, had been driven back, their ships scattered, their armies shattered. Humanity had won, and with it, the galaxy breathed a collective sigh of relief. But victory came with its own weight. The Peacekeepers, though proud of their accomplishments, were not blind to the cost. The war had taken a toll on their forces. Thousands of ships had been lost, and many brave soldiers had fallen in the fight. Earth, too, had been changed. The scars of the invasion still marked the planet, and rebuilding would take years. But for now, peace had returned, and with it came the promise of a new future. On Earth, the leaders of the Peacekeepers stood before the people. There were no celebrations or grand speeches. Instead, there was a quiet resolve. The people had suffered, but they had survived. They had proven themselves capable of extraordinary things, of outsmarting their enemies, of adapting when it seemed all hope was lost. Now, it was time to rebuild. The Peacekeeper commanders, though exhausted, met one last time. The war was over, but their duty was far from finished. They knew that the galaxy was vast, and while the invaders were defeated, new challenges would surely arise. There would always be threats, always forces that sought to conquer and destroy. Humanity had proved it was strong enough to fight back, but the Peacekeepers understood that this was only the beginning. "We've won," said one commander, his voice steady but tired. "But this war has shown us how fragile peace can be. We cannot rest. Not now, not ever." The others nodded in agreement. They had won a great victory, but they had seen what the universe was capable of. And they had learned something crucial during the war. It wasn't just their technology that made them strong. It was their unity, their ability to adapt, and most importantly, their will to survive. The galaxy may have believed humanity was weak, but the Peacekeepers had shown them the truth. When faced with impossible odds, humanity could rise to any challenge. Outside the command center, life began to return to normal. People rebuilt their homes, their cities, their lives. But the war had changed them all. They were no longer just survivors of an invasion. They were the architects of their own future. The lessons learned during the war would shape their path for generations to come. But even as the people of Earth began to heal, the Peacekeepers knew that their mission wasn't over. They had emerged victorious. But the universe was a vast and unpredictable place. There were many unknowns, and new dangers could rise at any moment. The Peacekeepers would always be ready to face whatever came next. As Earth began to rebuild, the Peacekeepers turned their attention to the rest of the galaxy. The war had taught them to think outside the box, to never be predictable, to always adapt. Their tactics had saved them, but they knew that it wasn't just about fighting. It was about protecting the future of humanity. The Peacekeeper fleet, once spread thin across the galaxy, was now consolidated, but their mission had expanded. They began to form alliances with other peaceful races in the galaxy, offering their knowledge and experience to help others prepare for the challenges ahead. No one could be sure if another war would come, but humanity was now prepared to stand tall in the face of whatever threat might arise. Across the galaxy, humanity's reputation had been forever changed. They were no longer seen as just another species in the galaxy. They were now respected, feared, and admired. The Peacekeepers had shown that even in the darkest of times, humanity could rise up and fight for what was right. The Peacekeeper commanders knew that there was much work to be done. They had built a strong foundation, but there were many challenges ahead. The future was uncertain, but it was also full of possibilities. The war had been won, but the real work, the work of building a lasting peace, had only just begun. The Peacekeepers' new mission was clear. They would not only defend humanity but would work to foster peace throughout the galaxy. They would help guide civilizations toward cooperation, unity, and understanding. And they would always be vigilant, ready to protect their home if darkness ever threatened again. In the quiet after the storm, humanity stood at the dawn of a new age. They had proven their strength, their resilience, and their ability to overcome even the greatest of challenges. And with that, they had earned their place in the galaxy, not just as survivors, but as leaders. The Peacekeepers had opened a new chapter, one that would see humanity reach new heights, not through war, but through unity, cooperation, and innovation. The Peacekeepers knew this would take time. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't always be without struggle. But they also knew that if humanity could survive the darkest days, they could rise to face any challenge the future held. And so, the Peacekeepers began their new mission. The war was over, but their work had only just begun. The galaxy was vast, but humanity was ready to face it together.